A Flash Outside the Off Stump. Episode 9. Ranji Saves England. By the end of his first county season, Ranji was firmly established as one of England's leading players. He was enormously popular with the public, especially in Brighton, although some in the cricketing world still harboured prejudices. Interestingly, these were often individuals with colonial links to India, so it may be that, while the public at large saw Ranji's origins as exciting and interesting, those who were used to seeing Indians in subservient roles saw him as an upstart. Two of his most outspoken critics were the former governor of Bombay Presidency, Lord Harris, and Edward Wynyard, the captain of Hampshire Cricket Club, who had been an army officer in Burma. Ranji's second season at Sussex started with high expectations. It was also a year in which the Australians were to tour England, and it was widely expected that he would be called on to play in the tests. 1896 was the last year in which England teams were not picked by a selection panel, but by the owners of the grounds on which tests were to be played. 3 tests against Australia were scheduled, for Lord's, Old Trafford and the Oval, so the selections for the summer's England teams were to be made by the MCC, Lancashire and Surrey respectively. The MCC committee was headed by Lord Harris, who regarded Ranji as a foreigner and a temporary resident, or bird of passage as he put it. Ranji was asked to make himself available, but was omitted from the final 11 to widespread public outcry.
Letter to Cricket Magazine, 18th of June 1896. I cannot understand the outcries raised against Ranjit Singh's possible inclusion in the England 11. Why should he not play for England? He is surely qualified to do so by playing for an English county and by getting his blue at Cambridge. The Australians are much worse sportsmen than I take them for if they would object. By parallel reasoning, neither McGregor nor O'Brien could legitimately be included in an English team, nor could Percy MacDonald, Charles Bannerman or William Midwinter properly have played for Australia. Nay, Lord Harris himself would have been ruled out. He was born in the West Indies. Mr. Bainbridge is not likely to be chosen, but if he were, a similar objection would apply to him. Assam was the land of his birth.
The writer raises a very interesting point, as well as exposing Lord Harris's hypocrisy. But Harris was applying a standard of nationality based on race rather than place of birth or residence, harking back to Daniel O'Connell's observation regarding whether the Duke of Wellington should be regarded as an Irishman. The poor old Duke, what should I say of him? To be sure, he was born in Ireland, but being born in a stable does not make a man a horse. Coincidentally, 30 years later, Ranji's nephew Dulip Singh, also a Sussex player, was selected to play for England against the South Africans, who after playing against him once, objected to his further inclusion in the England team as a foreign player. However, given South Africa's earlier record regarding their own mixed-race players such as Crom Hendricks and Charlie Llewellyn, it seems highly likely their objections were racially motivated. Back in 1896, the Australians raised no objection to Ranji's inclusion in the team for the second test at Old Trafford. Just to be sure, given Lord Harris's reservations, Ranji had insisted that the matter be raised with them beforehand, and Harry Trott, the Australian captain, replied that they would be delighted were he to play. Ranji warmed up for his test debut by turning out for the gentlemen versus players match at Lord's, scoring 47 off just 12 balls, scoring 11 fours and a 3, an innings which Wisden described as one of the most brilliant and delightful pieces of batting ever seen at Lord's. It was a performance which certainly impressed the MCC members filling the pavilion that day, and they gave him a standing ovation as he left the field, the members apparently not sharing the qualms of Lord Harris and his committee. Ranji's first test did not get off to a good start. England had inexplicably picked only 3 regular bowlers, and they soon tired in the heat, with the Australians racing to 240 for 2. Eventually, the English attack found a way through the Australians' late order, bowling them out for 412. But England immediately lost Grace for 2 and a second wicket on 23. Ranji, in at number 3, scored 62, and Lilly at number 8 scored 65 not out, but otherwise the English batting was poor. They were all out for 200 and forced to follow on. By the close of the second day, Grace was out again, and England were 109 for 4, defeat seeming inevitable. Expecting a fairly quick defeat, very few spectators turned up on the third day. Those who made the effort were rewarded with a display from Ranji, which Wisden described as marvellous.
Ranjit very quickly got set again and punished Australian bowlers in a style that no other English batsman had approached. He repeatedly brought off his wonderful strokes to the leg side, and for a while had the Australian bowlers quite at his mercy. His remarkable batting, and the prospect of the Englishmen after all running their opponents close, worked the spectators up to a high pitch of excitement, and the scene of enthusiasm was something to be remembered when the Indian cricketer completed his first 100.
England had recovered to score 305, with Ranji 154 not out, in an innings where their next highest score was only 19. The Australians still only needed 125 to win, but in the event lost 7 wickets before reaching their target. England had lost, but Ranji was a hero, widely acclaimed for preventing a total rout. But the acclaim was not universal. There had been a suspicion that Ranji's long wait for inclusion in the Cambridge varsity side had been down to prejudice as much as Cambridge's undoubted strength in depth, and Lord Harris was not alone in his objections to Ranji's inclusion in the England team. His successful debut was not enough to win over some of his enemies. In fact, it only enraged them further. Sitting in the grandstand at Old Trafford on that day was a young cricket writer called Home Gordon. A lifelong supporter of Sussex, he was already familiar with Ranji's talent, but felt that his performance in Manchester was one of his best yet. On his return to London, he met an old friend from the MCC, and enthusiastically recounted the details of Ranji's innings for England. Much to his surprise, the friend replied that Gordon ought to be expelled from the MCC for having
the disgusting degeneracy to praise a dirty black.
And Home Gordon later heard another MCC member complain about
a nigger showing us how to play the game of cricket.
Such assertions may have been in the minority, but they were there, and reflected both a belief in the white man's superiority and perhaps a mounting disquiet that it was being eroded by developments on the sports field. Furthermore, these were extreme attitudes which rejected non-white players altogether and made no allowances even for educated men from aristocratic backgrounds. Overall, though, Ranji's success as a batsman made it very difficult to argue with his selection, and his performances for England greatly strengthened his claim to a place. In the split between gentlemen and players, there was often a feeling that some of the so-called amateur players did not have to achieve the same standards as professionals to merit selection for the national team, but Ranji's talent was such that this at least was never an issue. At the end of the 1896 season, Wisden placed him at the centre of their annual Top 5 Players of the Year photograph. He had broken Grace's record for the most runs in a season with a very impressive 2,780. Such was his success that he was honoured with a widely reported banquet in the Cambridge Guildhall, which brought together many of the leading figures of Cambridge University, as well as his colleagues from the England and Sussex cricket teams, and a wide range of dignitaries and politicians. The Master of Trinity spoke at some length of the positive effect of Ranji's achievements on Anglo-Indian relations. For his part, Ranji replied with a speech expressing his happiness at living in England, and trusting that the wrongs done by Her Majesty's Indian subjects in the past, and the injustices inflicted upon them, could be forgotten, and that England and India might form one united country which would be the admiration and envy of other nations. The press coverage of this event doubtless meant well. It is hard to argue with their assertions that Ranji had indeed done a great service for Anglo-Indian relations by providing such an excellent role model, and when they described him as being like a star from the East, it was an acceptable use of poetic licence. However, much of the coverage also compared him to a panther, which may well have emphasised his suppleness, graceful movement and athleticism, but also brought his skin colour to the reader's attention, as did the frequent references to him as being dusky. And cricket put both Ranji and the Australians' success down to it having been an exceptionally hot summer.
In estimating the great success of KS Ranjit Singh and the Australians this season, it must not be forgotten that the very trying weather has been greatly in their favour. Upon English cricketers, especially those who have to play day after day, it has exercised a disquieting influence, whereas the Australians and the Prince have simply revelled in it, because it is just what they are accustomed to.
Having said this, the Star in its coverage of Ranji's banquet had no hesitation in describing him as the most popular man in England, suggesting that he might like to run for Parliament should any by-elections come up, because he would be almost certain to win. That autumn, Ranji was taken ill while shooting in bad weather, and, always prone to chest infections, was forced to endure 10 weeks bed rest. Rather than waste this enforced break, he conceived of and wrote a book which encapsulated his theories on cricket tactics and techniques. It is a remarkable work, and to tie in with its publication in the 60th year of Queen Victoria's reign, he called it his Jubilee Book of Cricket. The following spring, he decided to have a quick holiday in Europe before the season resumed. He set off for the French Riviera with C.B. Fry, but somehow when they reached Paris they turned east instead, crossing Germany and Austria and eventually wandering into the midst of the fighting between the Greeks and Turks, engaged in a battle on the mainland as a sideshow to their dispute over the ownership of Crete. Quite how or why they managed to get to the front line unchallenged and unscathed is not recorded, but they were back in Hove in time for Sussex's first matches, although they did miss most of the pre-season practice sessions. In previous seasons, Sussex had batted well but been let down by poor bowling. This year they had recruited Cyril Bland as a fast bowler, and Sussex finished in a very creditable 6th in the championship. Ranji again had a magnificent season, scoring 260 against the MCC, 157 against Lancashire, 129 not out against Middlesex, 149 against Hampshire, and 170 against Essex. The latter part of his season was quieter, as he had to contend with another prolonged bout of asthma, but it was another successful season for him, at the end of which he was selected for the England team to tour Australia that winter. The English were strongly fancied by the press, in a way that will be painfully familiar to modern followers of English cricket and football teams, to do great things in Australia. Unfortunately, success did not materialise. They were struck down by a flu epidemic on arrival, and although they recovered enough to win the first test handsomely, they lost the following 4 to an Australian side which was vastly more consistent in their standard of play. The English players struggled to adapt to the conditions, with only Ranji and Archie McLaren performing well, both posting averages in excess of 50. In the first test at Adelaide, Ranji had made himself unpopular with the partisan crowd by publicly agreeing with the umpire's no balling of the Australian fast bowler Jones. The crowd barracked him relentlessly, although eventually the Australian authorities conceded that Jones's action was suspect. The English were also heavily barracked by the crowd at Sydney during the 5th test, but evidently in between times Ranji at least was proving very popular with the Australian public.
Cornish Telegraph, 20th of January 1898. Ranji Mania. The editor of Chums has received a letter from a reader in Western Australia saying that since the arrival of the English cricketers out there, almost everything is named after Ranjit Singh, who is a great favourite in Australia. They now have Ranji squashes, Ranji boots, Ranji tobacco, besides many other things too numerous to mention.
Ranji decided to visit India on his way back from Australia, and in the event spent 11 months touring the country in the company of Arthur Priestley, an MCC member who later became the Liberal MP for Grantham. He thus missed the whole of the 1898 season in England, but made a lot of useful contacts among the ruling princes of India. While he was there, the British establishment was also considering behind the scenes whether he might not one day after all become the ruler of Nawanagar. Back in England for the next summer, he was once again in the England team for the first test, where his spirited second innings at Nottingham salvaged a draw for them in an otherwise disastrous match. While he was criticised in some quarters for batting in an attacking style when defending for a draw was required, the newspapers were in no doubt of his importance in saving the day, and the placards everywhere announced, "Ranji saves England," when the evening papers came out. The summer of 1899 was a difficult time, with the country deeply divided over the Boer War, which had just broken out in South Africa. Many at home suspected the war was less about morality than access to the South African gold and diamond fields, and public meetings were apt to end in arguments and brawls. Against such a background, the test matches were seen as a welcome diversion. For Ranji, it was an exceptionally busy summer. Not only was he the mainstay of the England side, but he had also taken over the captaincy of Sussex from Billy Murdoch. Despite this added responsibility, he shattered his own record for the number of runs scored in a season with an incredible 3,159, averaging over 76 in county championship matches. Ranji's timetable for that season reveals a punishing schedule in which he was often catching trains from one end of England to the other on the few days he wasn't playing. He was troubled by frequent bouts of insomnia and asthma, but played on regardless, and when the season finally ended in September, he must have been exhausted. Within a fortnight he was on board the Cunard liner SS Etruria, bound for America, where he had agreed to captain a team comprised of many of his England Test colleagues on a short tour of the USA and Canada. They won easy victories in Philadelphia, Haverford, New York and Toronto, and enjoyed a trip to Niagara Falls. The Americans were reportedly fascinated by the inclusion of an Indian prince in an English cricket team. By the end of the year he was finally back in Cambridge for a rest, and as 1900 began, he must have wondered what experiences the new century might hold.